Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the new Viltrox autofocus 24mm F1.8 STM lens, and this is for Sony FE, full frame mirrorless E-mount. I was really glad to see the roadmap for 2021 that showed Viltrox returning to development for full frame, and it was very welcome to see the 23mm, 33mm, and 56mm f1.4 primes for APS-C, all of which I reviewed last year on various platforms, Fuji, Sony E-mount, and then even Canon EF-M. And they did a great job with those lenses. They certainly were welcome additions. However, when I saw the proposed lineup of a 24mm, 35mm, and then 50mm f1.8, and I think even a potential maybe going into the next year of a 28mm f1.8, I was glad to see that, mostly because I think that there's certainly room, particularly at the 24mm and 50mm focal lengths, for a reasonably priced, good performing prime lens there. In the case of the 24mm focal length that we're looking at here today, basically your options tend to range to the f1.4 options, most notably the G Master lens, but that's going to run you $1,400 US. And there is one of the adapted Sigma art series, but it tends to be fairly large and still fairly expensive. And then you go all the way from that to like an f2.8 lens. And so, having an f1.8 that gives you a little bit more versatility in terms of aperture, but at a much more reasonable price point here of a little over $400 is certainly very, very welcome. And so I was glad to see that development, and obviously if they can do a good 50mm f1.8, very welcome there as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with the 35mm focal length, but there have been a lot of really good 35mm lenses released in the last couple of years for Sony, so maybe a little less demand there. But today we're going to take a definitive look at this particular lens. I'm filming on it right now on a Sony A9. It will give you a little bit of sense of both autofocus tracking during this segment, and then also a little bit of an idea of the quality of footage you can get out of the lens as well. Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist, modern wallet that sets you free from a bulky traditional wallet while also making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. Visit phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber. You can even customize your wallet with new accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even the Chipolo tracking integration if you're the kind of person who loses their wallet. Use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out. Now, if you want less detail, I would recommend that you check out the standard review instead, and it'll go through things a little bit more snappy. Today we're going to hit everything in detail. We're going to start by jumping in and taking a look at the build and the handling from the lens and see what you get for your money here. Another really nicely made lens from Viltrox, mostly metals in construction, metal a focus ring, and we've got both an aperture ring and a focus ring here. No switches, and what we see is that there still is no gasket here, and so weather sealing is not yet part of the design. They do have a special HD nano multi-layer coating up front that is said to be water resistant and have a kind of resistant to fingerprints and things like that. So something similar to a fluorine type coating, and so at least you do have that. However, it's a very attractive lens in terms of both the appearance and also I think the form factor. I think a very practical form factor. We have a lens that is 70mm in diameter and 85mm in length. That allows us a 55mm front filter thread up front. Filter threads are in metal, and so of course nice construction there. Also, the lens weighs in at 340 grams, which is really a moderate, weight for a metal construction lens, so nicely made, and also for a wider, focal length with a fairly wide maximum aperture. I like, just in terms of the aesthetic design, there's something about the bevel that comes in here to accommodate, a wider full frame lens that I just kind of like from a visual aesthetic. And so, but other than that, it's pretty similar in look to what we have been seeing on their APS-C lenses. Howbeit, the APS-C lenses do have the C, crop factor badge on them, whereas the badge here is more a reflection of their coatings that they have on the lens itself. So as noted, there's an aperture ring here. That aperture ring is declicked in the sense that there's markings here on the barrel, but there's no detents. The only detent that we have is that there's a nice amount of resistance between f16, minimum aperture, and then going over into A, and a nice satisfying click if you go into A and you control it from within the camera. And so that detent helps you from, accidentally, inadvertently switching over between the two. Everything moves here nicely. I have really no concerns or complaints about it. This is an aperture by wire, and so that means that, you can do aperture racking in theory. However, it's going to be electronically controlled, so not always perfectly smooth. And so it's, again, I don't find that these things are quite as effective as an actual mechanical aperture. Likewise, when it comes to the focus ring, actually nothing but good to report here. The damping is really beautiful. I think that the focus throw and the weight is just about right. It does a beautiful job in emulating manual focus, and so it's actually a nice experience. You will automatically get the active part of the focus area enlarged as you start to input if you're in manual focus and you have focus assist enabled. And so, it behaves basically just like a first-party Sony lens would in that regard. So as noted, one of the key things that has helped Viltrox to continue to kind of refine their lenses on the fly is that it does have, all of the lenses have this USB port right in it. So what has changed is that previously we had a micro USB port on all of their lenses. We've now moved to the, the newer standard of a USB-C, which is a little bit easier to use also in that it's universal. There's no wrong way to, plug it in terms of direction. And so I'm glad to see them, updating a more current standard there. I have one, maybe minor complaint here when it comes to the lens hood, and that is that on their previous APS-C lenses, you had a lens hood that's made of metal. It's definitely an upscale kind of lens hood that I really like. In this case, we have a cheaper plastic lens hood, and I would say this is the only evidence I saw of cost cutting in terms of the physical design. Overall, however, a very nice design. We do have 9 aperture blades inside. It is a rounded aperture design. However, one complaint I have about Viltrox lenses is that their aperture shape is inconsistent. And so when you're stopping down, you don't actually get a fully circular shape, and just because it's just not something they've done well yet, and I would like to see some improvement with that. And that will show up with your bokeh highlights, though in this case there won't be necessarily a lot of situations where you can create those. Minimum focus distance here is 30 centimeters, and you have a quite low 0.10 times magnification. So not an area of strength, howbeit I did see quite strong resolution and contrast at minimum focus, and so at least there is that plus there. And so a lot of really, I think, positive things there. I would love to see them, start to work towards including weather sealing in future lenses, but Viltrox has made such huge strides in the last couple of years, and I think that they've been really clever in their implementation of, easily applied firmware updates that essentially have allowed them to develop autofocus on the fly. And they've learned a lot of lessons. They've refined the process, and so a lot of progress there along the way. And I also think that they learned a valuable lesson in that they have found a balance between making nice constructed lenses, still metal casings, but done it in a more lightweight fashion. And I think this particular lens, and it looks like the other 2 lenses coming, are similar in size. They find a nice balance there between quality of construction and overall weight and size. So kudos to them on that front. Now this lens is equipped with a stepping motor, STM motor. And as I noted, they have been continuing to refine autofocus. And so when it comes to stills, I had 0 complaints during my review. I was able to get accurate quick focus, very quiet in operation. I could get good, IAF. It was, with my pet, for example. IAF is going to be more likely when you're up close with a wide focal length, because it's rare that the eye occupies enough of the sensor to actually get the box tracking the eye. But nonetheless, I could see that autofocus was accurate and good results on that. I also found that out shooting in the field, even if I was shooting at f1.8 and a more narrow depth of field, autofocus nailed, no concerns there. I was able to get this shot in a backlit situation, very strongly backlit, and I got accurate focus. So no complaints on that front. On the video front, first of all, we'll take a look at the sound and the quality of focus during focus pulls. So as you can hear, there is just the faintest amount of sound in a virtually silent environment in autofocus pulls. And so, under normal operations, no concerns there. I also noted that there was not any pulsing, but maybe just a little bit of slowdown as it reached the subject to lock focus, but it did so accurately. And the quality of pulls in between was nice and smooth. And so, good things there. Obviously, you've been able to see what's happening during this particular segment and seen how good a job it stayed sticking on my face. But I can at least give you feedback from a previous episode that I shot, just a kind of a brief teaching episode about 7 minutes long. And what I found during that is that as long as I had eye contact, it did very, very good. No shifting, no moving of focus. If I looked down at notes, for example, and then looked back up, as I looked down, focus would drift a little bit away. It would come back when I made eye contact. If I got too demonstrative, which I tend to do when I speak, sometimes there would be some distractions and I would get a little bit of a shift, but very few and very far between, and it very quickly came back to accurate focus. It never got stuck in the wrong place. So overall, that's actually a fairly good performance, considering with a wide-angle lens, there tends to be more in the frame, more potential distractions. And so, I wouldn't say that it's first-party excellent yet. One thing that Viltrox has demonstrated is that they are willing to continue to update things via firmware update. And so I'm encouraged by that. So how about image quality? I know a lot of people this is where the rubber meets the road, because you don't mind a cheaper alternative, but you want it to perform well. Let's take a look together to see if the Viltrox 24mm f1.8 does deliver in the image quality department. So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion, both of which offer up some concerns here. So the first thing that I will point out is that while there is only a mild amount of distortion, you can see that across most of the frame it's not too bad. There's just a little bit of barrel distortion, but you can see it's a somewhat complex pattern, what we would call a mustache pattern with bulges and dips, which means that it is hard to manually correct for and get a perfect correction there, because you tend to overcorrect or undercorrect, kind of depending upon where you're looking in the frame. We can also see that vignette is fairly heavy and fairly heavily concentrated in the corners, which also gives you a little bit of concerns for a manual correction. So with those concerns, knowing that that could be an issue, I did reach out to Viltrox and said, this is a lens that needs a profile. Well, fortunately, they had one ready to go, and as you can see, it does a pretty good job of correcting. It does take a little bit of work, and I'm going to throw a link into the description on the video of how to get the profile #1 and then how to install it. But once you manually install it into your Adobe database here for Adobe Camera Raw, you can see that you can apply this and it will do a good job. And there are other Viltrox profiles out there, kind of depending on what what you've got. I've installed a few of them because I have a few of these lenses on hand. Now it's definitely worth taking the time if you're going to buy the lens and getting the profile and installing it, because as you can see, I just couldn't do that great a job with a manual correction. And so, here's a -2 dialed in. It's just not, it's uneven. And you can see vignette, I slid the vignette slider all the way to the right and the midpoint all the way over, and it's still not perfectly nailed there. So definitely this is the cleaner end result. So get that profile. Now, in many real-world scenes, you're not going to see the distortion unless you really have very straight lines like we did on our test chart, but that vignette is another factor altogether. And so here all I've done is just added that profile, and you can see that it makes a pretty radical difference to the look of the image. Now, I looked hard for various aberrations as a part of my review. We can see that under most typical circumstances, the places where I would expect to see chromatic aberrations, longitudinal chromatic aberrations, are really well controlled. I mean, there's a tiny bit of a grain fringing there, very minimal, not a whole lot going on here in bokeh highlights either, and so no major concerns there. In this really bright scene here, where you have very bright light coming through this window frame at wide open, I was able to see a little bit of purple fringing on just some of these edges here, but again, yeah, this was the only time that I saw this and under a fairly extreme circumstance. But for the most part, I would say that aberrations are pretty well controlled. We can see, stop down where you would typically see your lateral CA really strong along the edges. If it were there, we can just see that lateral CA is just well controlled. Everything is just black and white in transition, no evidence of fringing around the edges. Here's a look at our MTF, and it shows that the black lines here would be f1.8. You can see that there is a dip as you start to approach the middle of the frame, dips quite a bit, and then kind of goes a little up and down towards the edge of the frame. Then later on we can see if it stopped down, what we should expect to see is a fairly strong performance across the frame, staying up at a very high level and a fairly even performance. We'll see if that shows up as we move ahead. So let's take a look at resolution and contrast. This is on a 42 megapixel A7R3. All the typical lockup and make sure that we get the right results. This is a 200% magnification, so we're really putting things under a microscope here, which is the way that I do things. And so you can see that contrast is only okay. Here in the center of the frame, stopping down to F2 gives us a tiny bit of contrast boost. Here in the mid-frame result is not bad, not exceptional, but not bad, and we can see that stopping down hasn't made much of a difference there. Down in the corner results also not bad, some improved contrast when stopped down. Now I will point out at f1.8 on I actually shot this on my A9, so it's a lower resolution sensor, but it gives you a little bit of a real world perspective here. This is 100% magnification, and you can see that that looks really pretty fantastic there in terms of resolving the fine details. And so this is a lens that certainly is capable of giving you good results when put into the right situation. So we can see the stop down, full stop from f2 to f2.8 definitely starts to sharpen things up and gives us higher contrast. Center of the frame is looking quite good now. Mid-frame is looking better, you can see in terms of contrast and resolution. And even down into the corner, now the corners are looking quite good, really, with good detail rendered right off towards the edge. From f2.8 to f4, you can see things are better still, with corners now looking quite excellent. So for some perspective, here's the 24mm f3.5 from Sigma that I recently reviewed. And you can see that here in the corner, I give a little bit of an edge to Sigma, but not by much. It's kind of a give and take depending upon how you look at and where you look at. I think there is maybe a little bit more, resolution from the Sigma, but it's not much different. And you probably wouldn't see it if you didn't have them side by side. Stopping the Viltrox onto f5.6 gives us just a bit more boost in terms of contrast and punch. And looking back in the center of the frame, everything is looking excellent here now at f5.6. So I did also a real-world comparison between the two lenses that I just mentioned, and so a couple of things I want to point out. First of all, you can see that the Viltrox is notably wider in terms of the framing. There's more in the frame. Basically everywhere that I look, you can see further out there, and even if we go to the other side, it's not any kind of shift. It was done on a tripod, and you can see that it's just wider across the frame. The second thing I want to point out is that I do think that the Sigma gives us a little bit better micro contrast, and you can just see there's more of a diversity between the bright and the dark than what we see here. And so, I mean, again, you probably wouldn't see it if you weren't looking at them side by side, but I do think there's a bit of an edge to the Sigma when it comes to that micro contrast. Real world results I thought were nice from the lens. You can see here that We've got nice detail on the, outside of the sauna here and looking off into the trees. Everything is looking nice. I also saw fairly decent flare resistance. You can see that here we've got a little bit of prismatic veiling. Stop down, you get a little bit more of a definite ghosting pattern. You can see a little artifact here, but contrast remains really strong and there's not a whole lot damaging the actual image here. Here's a second example with the sun up on the right side here. You can see again, contrast looks pretty good. And in terms of ghosting artifacts, you've basically only got that little thing, which I don't think is going to damage too much. You've got a couple of tiny little blobs here, but they occupy a small enough amount of space that I don't think they're going to be a major issue. Here's a real world shot where I wasn't trying to create flare, and you can see bright sun right in the frame. And I don't really see any damage to the image anywhere. It looks to me like contrast has held up well, and we've got good detail here. And so flare resistance, I think, is fairly strong. You can see panning across the sun, there is places where there's a bit of loss of contrast, and stop down, you can see a little bit more of that ghosting artifact, but everything is fairly well controlled. Now you can see that we have a fairly decent looking sunburst effect here. It's not, the greatest that I've seen. Rounded blades tend to give you a not as defined of shafts coming off of it, but certainly a nice addition to an image and nothing ugly about it for sure. Now, while the magnification figure is not great, you can see that the out of focus region looks, pretty decent, and we can see here looking at our subject that the subject also has nice detail. So, I certainly wouldn't hesitate to use the lens in this fashion, even if that's not a particular strength for it. So how about for shooting astro? Wide open, I have a few, criticisms here. First of all, there is a little bit of a fringing aberration that happens on the really bright points of light. And as you move off towards the edge of the frame, you can see that there definitely is some coma with things becoming winged, as you move towards the edge of the frame. So that's not great there. That being said, if you stop down to f2.8, which of course is where a lot of competitors are anyway at this focal length, you'll find that both of those things clear up. And so no longer do we see the fringing. You can see that that is much better controlled. You can also see that a lot of the coma is eliminated if you stop down to f2.8, which gives you a much cleaner result. One final thing I wanted to point out is I just kind of noticed by accident that as I threw the lens on my A9 out for a hike, that I actually liked the results better. I just felt like maybe the sensor was a little bit better a match because results look really quite nice here in this application. And so you can see that at that lower resolution, detail looks good. I always do like the A9's color a little bit better too, and I thought that's reflected here. But detail looks great in the image, and look at one more here. And you can just see that at the lower resolution, it's still a little bit of drop off towards the edge, but I think that by and large there's a lot of nice detail here. And anyway, I like the look of images that were taken on the A9. So overall, I think the results, I would say, are positive. I certainly would recommend that you download that profile, and I will throw a link to that in the description down below, and so you know where to go and get it from. And because it certainly does make a difference. The vignette, as you saw, is heavy, but that distortion, while it's mild, I actually don't see it in a lot of real-world results, but certainly if you have those straight lines, it is complex enough that it's simpler to correct for using a profile rather than trying to attempt it manually. And so I would grab that. The real negative here is the fact that to this point at least, there is not in-camera support for Viltrox lenses. And so that means that if you're shooting JPEG and video, you're not getting correction in camera. And of course, you can see right now I'm shooting at f4. You can see how things look without correction. But anyway, that's what I would say is my chief concern on that front. So at the end of the day, I think that this is a nice alternative at a lower price point to some other lenses. I certainly, like the fact that you have a larger maximum aperture, gives you more flexibility in what you can do with the particular lens. And then, of course, its price point means that it's less than half the price of, say, the 20mm F1.8 G lens from Sony, which, by the way, I really, really like that lens. And if your budget extends that far and you like 20mm, it's a great alternative. The G Master, 24mm F1.4 G Master is a great lens. but it's going to run you more like 13 or 1400 US dollars as opposed to a little over 400. So we're not even talking about an apples to apples comparison there. But in many ways, I consider this Viltrox to be kind of a poor man's 24mm GM lens. Obviously the aperture's not as big, the build and the autofocus is not quite as good, but it does a lot of the same things that the G Master does, just not quite as well. But it gives you some of the same kind of versatility for your photography. And so if your budget isn't G Master deep, then this might be a good alternative for you. Certainly a very welcome addition to the platform. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also linkage to an image gallery. You can check out more photos. There are buying links there, but this, of course, lens is very new, just coming to market. Some of them might take a little while to fully populate, but be patient, they will be there. There's also linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron and help support what I'm doing. Sign up for my newsletter that comes out every Thursday, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Make sure to click for be notified when new content drops. Thanks for watching today. Have a great day, and let the light in.